Welcome back to the Rum Ration podcast. I'm Colin, and as always, I'm joined by my partner in crime and my fellow Gagetown survivor, Rejoy.
Ah, yes, the days of our halcyon youth, Colin, back in good old Gagetown. Well, it's great to be here as always, and we've spent plenty of time talking about the sharp end of the bayonet. Think episode 5, the camaraderie in the trenches, episodes 8 and 9, and the weight of a ruck on a long march, which is pretty much all of them.
All of them.
And something that we've all experienced personally there. But today we're looking at the weight of something else, something every Canadian soldier in the latter half of the Second World War knew by heart. Today we're talking about the Lee-Enfield No. 4.
That's right. And just under 1 million of these beauties were produced right here in Canada, which I bet you most Canadians didn't realize.
Yeah.
And for those who think that only Quebec gets defense contracts, it was actually produced in Ontario out of a Crown corporation in Long Branch, Ontario, which is basically now part of Metropolitan Toronto. It's basically, I guess, absorbed into Etobicoke. And it was called the Small Arms Limited. But today isn't just about steel and bolt actions. No, more importantly, it's about the wood, the furniture as it is.
Yeah, exactly. And to tell that story, we've got William Patterson with us.
That's right. William was referred to us by a friend and a fellow Treble Victor member. Actually, Rejoy, do you remember one of my roommates on Phase 2, Mark Walden? Tall, blonde, goofy guy from RMC. Yeah.
I do, yes.
Tragically, he died of cancer about 10 years ago, but he founded a military networking group called Treble Victor. And it's very successful. And Dave Sutcliffe and I are members, and that's how I got this connection to William. So look at that. Gagetown keeps coming back no matter what happens.
That's right. But
William is a master's student in history at the University of Ottawa, and he's writing his thesis on the Long Branch Lee-Enfield No. 4 Mark I, and specifically the lumber supply chain that fed it. The wood, the mills, the labor, the bottlenecks, all of it. And his research sits right at the intersection of 20th century Canadian military history, environmental history, and industrial history, which is a perfect lens for today's episode. And it's kind of interesting you think about it, Richard. We had Joanne on before, too. She's a specialist in that. And we've got someone else, Stephen Bright, coming up, who's also a specialist in industrial history. We didn't even know this stuff existed.
I know. Didn't even know the words. But it's so apt for the world that we live in today. And William's not just any armchair historian either.
No.
William is a primary reserve infantry corporal with the storied Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, and he's been serving for 8 years now. Now, William, your research has taken you deep into the forests of southern Ontario and the civilian supply chains that actually made this, legend possible. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. There's a little secret about the industrial history thing, and that's you can kind of just put whatever adjective in front of history you want and pretend it's a field. So that's why we're all industrial historians. So I don't know. I just I kind of got into it because I was just I was actually interested in the environmental history part first in the lumber supply chain during the war, but it got a little dull, and so I sort of went back to my military history roots, and that's how I sort of found a good cross section there.
That is a great connection. Yeah.
And before we get into the sawdust and the logistics of the 1940s and the ramping up to 1 million rifle production, which is pretty impressive, we have to talk about the man behind the action, the bolt action, as it were. Most men think of the Lee-Enfield as a purely British weapon, and of course, the Lee-Enfield is pretty much synonymous with the Union Jack when you think of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's actually, which was a bizarre connection for us to discover, there's a massive Canadian connection right at the start, isn't there?
So James Paris Lee was, I think he was born in Scotland, but he lived a lot of his life in Ontario, just east of Ottawa. He was one of the designers. So the term Lee-Enfield is a hyphenation of his name, Lee and Enfield, which was the Royal Small Arms factory there.
Right.
And he came up with the bolt action system and the detachable box magazine. He was a watchmaker, so he's very into sort of precise manufacturing.
There's something about Scots coming to Canada to build rifles, I guess. Although he was there, right? He had the Ross rifle, who was a Scottish inventor.
That's right. Which we talked about that too.
We do have an episode on that as well. We've got episodes on everything. You got to cover it for sure.
And the thing
sure.
is, as infantrymen, I mean, we love that idea of that fast bolt action because the Lee-Enfield was remarkably fast, wasn't it? And so fast, in fact, that in the First World War, 1914, the Germans thought they were up against machine guns,
That's right.
and they were just bolt action rifles. But the thing was, William, in the 1880s, the British War Office was, well, unsurprisingly, skeptical of repeating rifles, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean it's a fairly typical story. I think there's always sort of an institutional conservatism. They were sort of worried
Well
about.
said. Well said.
Wow. I think you have a career in diplomacy ahead of you.
um, they were kind of worried about the complexity. Like you always are. Like that. I realize this is before that, but we talked about the Ross rifle and how complexity can be a bad thing
Sure.
for weapons in the field. Like once again, a lot of sort of leadership. There was a worry of kind of a waste of ammunition.
Ah, yes.
But I mean, yeah. Sorry, I don't really know how to use the last 2 points there.
Which were the fact that the weapon was pretty complex, and the worry about using too much ammunition was two things. One was the cost of the ammunition itself, obviously, and the second thing was by burning out too much ammunition, you could burn out the barrels. So if these dastardly, cowardly soldiers were actually firing at the enemy, charging at them, as opposed to just standing there and getting killed, like a man should do, they're
Wearing
not
his
only
red coat.
wasting the cost of the rounds, or could possibly be wearing out the barrel, premature wearing, which would mean that the barrel would have to be changed. And we knew that the War Office would never want to pay for that. So
Yeah.
do you know why the famous, because originally like the Lee Metford weapon was what helped colonize a good chunk of the globe and turn the majority of the world's map that British hue of pink. But do you know when that Metford part of the name disappeared?
It came around
why,
when
I guess?
it came around when they shifted from sort of like black powder propellant to cordite. The cordite caused problems with sort of heat and pressure because it's better explosive, so it fires or propels around faster. So it wore out the rifling really quickly. And so there was an Enfield redesign that sort of gave the rifling deeper grooves and a new profile.
Right.
And then that's why it becomes the Lee-Enfield, because it was redesigned at Enfield.
Right.
Yeah,
Because cordite burns hotter and harder, doesn't it? So essentially it's just ripping out those shallow Metford grooves that were the original barrels, weren't they?
exactly.
Yeah, you go back to our last episode. Rejoy had a good discussion on black powder, and because we were talking about the redcoats, and and you got all the black powder and the clouds of smoke, and then when you had this new smokeless cordite powder, and I didn't realize that it also had such much more explosive power that it damaged the barrels too.
That's right. We didn't realize that at the time, right? I mean, it's very interesting, and again, the whole complexity of the battlefield changes.
Yeah, and all this technology is changing relatively rapidly, and then you come into the Second World War at the end of the 19th century, and that was a wake up call for the earlier Lee-Enfield patterns, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. So there was obviously some practical issues, sort of the length and the clumsiness of the rifle. The loading speed was slow, the handling was slow. The Mauser, which a lot of the Boers used, as they were sort of German heritage, was sort of faster to load, and sort of more fitted to modern, I guess, battlefield realities.
So the Mauser was actually looking better in comparison at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And that led to some changes and to what we now universally known as the creation of the SMLE, the short magazine Lee-Enfield, and that's a rifle that we're all sort of familiar with when we talk about the Lee-Enfield.
Yep, exactly.
And you probably saw me twitch there when you mentioned German heritage for Boers. I think your average Boer would probably eviscerate you for saying that. The Mauser definitely had a German heritage, but the Boer themselves were more of a Dutch heritage.
But William, tell us what made the SMLE better as a rifle? What were the main advantages?
It was, I think, fairly easy to rapid fire.
Right.
especially after the Boer War, that was sort of one of the issues they ran into was that sort of classic British marksmanship wasn't yet a thing. It came out of the Boer War because
Right.
the Boer who grew up on the South
They
Africa
were.
were really great
Yeah.
at thinking things, and the British city kids weren't so much.
Yeah, and suddenly you had shooting clubs growing up, and like all the parks and
Yeah.
in metropolitan areas all over England in the first part
Exactly.
of the 20th century were being taken over as like shooting grounds on the weekends. It's pretty wild.
Exactly.
It kind of, if you want to draw a parallel, go back hundreds of years. It was like back in the medieval days, in the 13th century, 14th century, where the English trained with the bow, and they
Yeah.
had shooting clubs set
Yep.
up then,
Yeah, good
to
call.
teach them to fire the yew bow. And now, fast forward in the 20th century, and got the same sort of thing going on with
Yeah,
the
that legacy
Lee-Enfield
and the Boy Scouts, right? Both of those
and the
came
Boy
out of the Boer
Scouts.
War. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, if the SMLE was so good, and it it proved to be a complete workhorse in the First World War, the mud didn't bother it in the trenches. It was reliable. The
Yeah.
first thing the Canadians did is when they came over the Ross rifle was toss their Ross rifle aside any chance they could get to pick up an SMLE. So, but if the SMLE was so good, and it was firing a 303 round, why do we move to the number 4 for the Second World War?
Different reasons. The SMLE was sort of was a fairly complicated design, I guess you could say.
Okay.
And there was an interest in sort of redesigning it so that it was a bit simpler to manufacture,
Yeah.
especially in the late 20s and the 30s. There were questions of sort of faster manufacturing. I assume they learned a lot about sort of military industrial production at scale during the First World War.
Right.
Yeah, especially when you needed all that manpower, and you'd want to draft those guys to the front as opposed to having them laboriously hand fitting wooden furniture onto an
Yes,
SMLE.
exactly.
Right.
Yes,
Exactly.
exactly. So
Exactly.
what were the big changes they made in their production to simplify things?
There were a few. There were a few. I'd say there was they moved the sight system back, so the rear sight was kind
Oh,
of in front of the ejection port in the SMLE, and they moved
oh,
it to behind the ejection port for the number 4. I guess the more distance you have between the front and the rear sight, the easier or the more accurate it is. Um, and they had like an aperture sight, so like a circle as
Yeah.
opposed to a kind of a groove.
right.
It makes it
Mhm.
easier to take up a sight picture. There was a slightly heavier barrel
Mm,
that
that rapid
improves
fire we're talking about.
accuracy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Stability, that gives you the stability. Yeah.
exactly. They'd simplified a lot of the receiver and the body for machining sake. It took less time to make.
Yeah.
And yeah, really, it was about manufacturability, I'd say. It was a good rifle, but they figured they could make it better.
So we're moving from, say, the old style of hand hand creating a rifle, moving to mass production instead.
Yeah.
All right, so
Yeah,
let's set the stage here. It's 1939. Canada enters a war. The Royal Montreal Regiment, as part of the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Division, is mobilized. I have
We
to
are.
we have to get the
Have
RMR
to
into
do it.
everything, and is one of the first units, of course, to go across to the UK, and of course, probably bringing SMLEs with them at that point. And you're
Yes,
telling me
that's
that they're
right.
going to change to this rifle here, but we're not exactly. Canada's entering the war, but we've perhaps neglected our defense industry and military somewhat since the First World War. We're not exactly a weapons production powerhouse yet. What? Tell us, William. What does a small arms situation look like in Canada?
It's non-existent, more or less. You know,
No,
that's
don't sugarcoat it. Don't
so much for
sugarcoat it.
diplomacy.
I think there are some probably like hunting rifles being manufactured, but that's obviously very different from military weapons. It's kind of important to remember that Canada, like the rest of the world in 1939, was still sort of trying to escape the Great Depression.
Hmm.
And so there was sort of no capital to invest in any kind of defense production.
Right.
And Mackenzie King, the prime minister at the time, was also not very keen on military production as a way of
Stimulating,
generating revenue.
Yeah.
unlike the current prime minister.
So very, very unprepared for what was to come.
Exactly. And they relied a lot
Right.
on British equipment.
And the funny thing how a war suddenly changes things, doesn't it? Like all of a sudden, we are now at war. Anybody got a rifle? I,
I
I
mean,
think I think at the RMR we had one Bren gun at the time. Did we not?
the shared Bren gun, yes. They were
The
good,
share,
good terms
yes,
looking at.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, that's because there was no ammunition on it. But well, as we say, every story has a turning point, and for Canadian production, that was 1940, was it not?
Yeah, exactly. So in 1939, when the first Canadian division went over, they basically, went over with almost no equipment and had to rely on British equipment. It kind of worked out for everybody because the British made money on it. But then sort of May 1940 happens. For people not necessarily well versed in the Second World War, that was when the Germans sort of invaded France and the lowlands, and they kind of
Yes.
it was a
Well, they
it
just
was a
rolled through
horrible
them.
experience
Yes.
for the
Yes.
Western Allies. And
Yes.
so
That's putting it mildly.
Suddenly that promise of equipment, whoops,
Yeah.
we left it all in Dunkirk.
exactly. Yeah, actually, I think they left something. The British left something like 80 or 90,000 rifles in Dunkirk, along with a bunch of other stuff. Canada left some equipment by accident because there was a little
Detour.
venture into there.
I'm guessing our
Um,
Bren gun might have been left behind too.
Exactly. Yeah, and it created like some panic, a lot of panic, basically across the Western Alliance because the French sort of were knocked out of the war,
Yes.
more or less. And so the idea that, at least in Canada, the idea that, okay, we're going to kind of do what we can to support this, but we have no interest in fighting this war, sort of was out the window. It's still a very British country.
Yeah.
And so just everybody was coming up with ideas on how we could sort of create a military industry out of nothing. C.D. Howe, the Minister of Munitions and
everything.
Supply.
Yeah.
Minister of everything was his nickname.
Yeah, exactly.
Sam Hughes of World War II.
That's right. without putting himself in for as many Victoria Cross nominations. So,
but yeah, he was huge. He was huge, and he.
So it was a real wake up call, wasn't it? I mean, when the Blitzkrieg hit the Western Front, all of a sudden reality hits, and we're in a really bad position. So everyone begins to wake up and ramp things up.
Yep, and we can't rely on the British anymore because the Germans can bomb all of their industry now.
Yeah.
So it's very
it makes
dire
Canada a
situation.
safe place to be, right? You can you're far, far, far away from the Luftwaffe.
Exactly.
You can set up your factories, and suddenly urgency kicks off, and debt rises because the governments have an existential threat that they'll just borrow against it, and so then you've got budgets exploding, and Canada starts building a big capacity it never thought it would have, and that kind of leads to the birth of the Small Arms Limited at Long Branch, Ontario.
Yes.
Yep, exactly. So it was sort of Crown operated or government operated, really. It gave the government a lot of control. It didn't operate at a profit. It sort of covered its expenses, and that was about it.
I think they learned a little bit from the First World War as well, right? About when it comes to manufacturing at this point, no war profiteering, nothing like that.
Right.
This is an
Yeah.
emergency. This is a crisis. We need to get everything in gear.
Exactly. Yeah, that was a pretty big issue during the First World War, and it was also Toronto was sort of close to everything. I mean, without with due deference to the rest of the country, it does sort of become the heart of the country, especially when the body politic goes into shock and all the money sort of sucks into the middle.
That's
It's always
right.
on Tory.
Yes.
So there were, the Long Branch factory was previously a range. So they sort of had some
right.
important
Okay.
infrastructure
Yeah.
there. Obviously it's Toronto, all kinds of people to work there. And they just started building. They started taking orders before the building was done. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's probably a good moment for us to pause for our first fantasy sponsor.
That's right, Colin. This episode is unofficially brought to you by Long Branch Furniture Reserve, the rum that pairs well with bolt actions, bad timelines, and wood that has no business behaving that well.
Distilled under wartime pressure, kiln aged in a warehouse that smells faintly of linseed oil and government urgency.
Indeed, tasting notes include yellow birch, machine grease, and the gentle panic of realizing your simple part is actually a supply chain.
That's right, Long Branch Furniture Reserve, because walnut is nice, but the war is not waiting.
No, it's not waiting at all. You know who else is not waiting? The Germans aren't waiting.
No, they're
because
not.
because now we're in 1940 and Dunkirk hits, and guess what? Britain needs weapons yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. Like I mentioned, they left something like 90,000 of their rifles in Dunkirk.
Yeah.
And they didn't have a lot. It was sort of in the 20s and the 30s. The British Army was more of like a colonial police action force.
Right.
So they
Yes.
relied on sort of technological superiority, not numbers.
Yes.
And so there was this huge rush to ship sort of any kind of weapons they could to the British because they were sort of expecting the Germans to cross the channel.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. They were
I'm-
preparing for invasion, weren't they?
Yeah.
Exactly. I
Operation Sea
remember
Lion.
reading in the files that there was this whole thing about increasing Canadian and American production of 45 ACP rounds because they were just giving them all the Thompsons they had in the U.S. because they needed something.
Yeah.
Um,
Ross rifle, actually, surplus Ross rifles
right.
were sent over.
That's
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
The Home Guard was equipped with a Ross.
Exactly. And I think at some point the Home Guard was basically, it was kind of like that enemy at the gate scene where it was like one rifle to two
exactly.
guys.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
that's
sentries
right,
would
yes.
exchange rifles. Like,
Exactly.
Yes.
The
Yes.
rifle.
Yes.
Exactly.
First man gets killed, you pick up his rifle.
The second continues.
Yes. So for the Home Guard, it was the first man drops his broomstick, you get the rifle. Yeah, those dire days. So it became it was a real scramble to try and figure out where they were going to get the weaponry from and re-equip the armies. So William, we've talked about Long Branch, but the story of the number 4 SMLE is actually continental, isn't it? The Americans were deep in this too, even before they're officially in the war. So again, you know, there was an American contribution long before anything official happened.
Yep, exactly. There was, I mean, the U.S. obviously had a fairly large industry, and they didn't really hide that they sort of supported the British, even though they weren't interested in fighting war at that time.
Yeah.
They were interested in making money, though.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's
Gold,
a
by the way,
reoccurring
gold.
theme.
Gold. You will pay in
Gold,
gold. No, we will
Um,
not extend credit.
Yeah, so
So nothing's really changed.
Well,
yeah, exactly.
He said this time to their own citizens too, you know. No, no credit for you.
now, it's not a politics podcast.
That's right.
Yeah. So they had a lot of they didn't make kind of firearms in the same calibers, if you will, as the British did. I think a lot of the weapons they ended up using were 30 caliber, maybe 30-06.
Right.
And so there were all kinds of commissions going everywhere, you know, Canadians going to the US, British coming to Canada to buy from the Americans, all kinds of weird little things like that. Of course, that's when Lend-Lease sort of starts to get involved.
hmm
And in 1941, actually, there was this thing called the Hyde Park Agreement, where Roosevelt and Mackenzie King sort of met at the president's like summer home in Hyde Park, and sort of scribbled out the first sort of U.S.-Canada free trade agreement on the back of a napkin.
That sounds right.
Yeah, to sort of facilitate military production for the war effort.
See, those were civilized days, Colin.
Civilized,
You have a martini. You talk about arming the world. You know, scribble the details on the back of the martini napkin.
And then go have a seance with your dead mom, right? Just to make sure you're doing it right. Yeah. But so I guess it's one thing to start cooperating on these things, but you need to start paying for these cross-border components as well, because I'm presuming that making the Lee-Enfield would require some American parts. Is that correct?
At first, the policy was not to use as little sort of American or British foreign equipment as possible. Machine tools, obviously, that was one that they couldn't get around, so they had to buy machine tools from the US and from the British. But generally, Canada tried to at least build the number 4 with Canadian parts. That didn't always work. there was this huge thing in 1943 where there was a backlog of extractor springs because the Canadian factory that made them just like failed too, and so
Oh,
they had to start buying American extractor springs. But yeah, I'd say largely there was a very it's actually a very interesting economic story behind it all. You know, who's using U.S. dollars or Canadian dollars to buy what?
yeah.
British pounds. The Americans don't want British pounds. We didn't want British pounds, so we took them anyways. Um,
Yeah, you're right. There's three different currencies at
That's
play
right.
there. It makes
yeah,
it a challenge.
yeah,
I mean,
It's
exactly.
not
Plus
just the
gold.
nuts and bolts
yeah,
and the extractor
yeah.
pins.
Well,
Exactly.
that's a whole deep episode in of
Yeah,
itself, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
economics of warfare and the currencies involved and all that sort of stuff.
So
yeah,
this you're
exactly.
basically telling us, William, here about like Long Branch is becoming part of like an integrated North American production story.
Yeah, absolutely. For what it's worth, I haven't been able to positively confirm that all the lumber used at Long Branch came from Canada. I'm
Ah,
just
Ah,
half guessing, building my thesis around that.
okay.
I'm kidding. But a lot of the lumber they used was more common in the U.S. So
Right, but the whole point here was to ramp up production as fast as possible so that they could pump out as many rifles and as many other weapons as they could as possible. 'Cause I
exactly.
think the Sten gun, Rejo, we
mm,
did an episode on that.
yes,
It also came from maybe not Long Branch, but around
Same
because there's
factory.
that whole
that's
corridor in
right.
Mississauga.
That's right. Yes,
Yeah, and the Avro
yes,
Arrow also was built up
yes,
there. So,
yes. I
uh,
think we mentioned the Long Branch factory in that episode,
yeah,
Yeah.
I
if
think
I'm
you're
not
right.
mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing about the Americans, though, is they love standardization, right?
Hmm.
Making non-standard weapons is not their thing. Like, I mean, think of fast forward to D-Day, where in terms of armor, the British had all the what they call the funnies, right?
Yeah,
The Americans said, "No, we're driving our Shermans onto the beach.
that's right.
That's it."
As
And
they are.
some, yes, yes, they are. Yeah, exactly.
If they
They,
sink, well, we'll just drive over that one. See, we're creating
yes.
our own
Next
bridge.
one, yeah, keep going. Yeah. So that was an interesting thing, wasn't it? Because standardization makes production easier, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So the number four, like we mentioned earlier, was sort of designed to be a bit more standardized and a bit easier to produce. But the Canadians and the Americans, and I think most of the Canadians and the Americans actually ended up sort of working together or working in tandem,
Yeah,
maybe is a better way of putting it,
yeah,
to simplify that design even more, which became the number four Mark One Star, which was, like I said, an even more simplified version of the rifle. They stamped more pieces. They any kind of shortcuts that could come out.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so they redesigned it so modern factories could kind of pump them out.
yeah. As
Uh,
many as possible, as quickly as possible. That was the target.
exactly. Um, I think Canada started making them in the summer of 1941 was when they started to finally produce these rifles, and they were making them before Mark One, so the sort of original design. And I think it was a few thousand that they ended up making, and then
Okay.
by the next year they were making a few 100,000 because of
Wow.
the redesign.
Oh,
So it's a
wow.
very
Yeah,
very huge difference.
yeah.
But they weren't all coming out of Long Branch, right? The Americans set up a factory as well.
Yep, I think they had two along the northern border. I couldn't place them exactly, but the Americans ended up making, I think, 1.2 million rifles. Actually, the
Okay.
three countries, Canada, the U.S., and the U.K., that made these rifles, Canada technically made the least.
Okay.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Yeah,
yeah, the British made something like 2 million or something like that.
So a lot of
So
rifles being
yeah.
produced.
huge numbers of these things being
But
created.
one of the things the Americans have always excelled in is mass manufacturing.
Mm,
They know how to ramp up production and get stuff out there. Very practical, very straightforward.
Yeah.
Uh, they know what they're doing in that case. Uh, I mean, like they used to say, the the American army was run by General Motors, General Electricity. Those were their generals, and they were fantastic at it. They
Absolutely.
did like no other army in the world.
And one of those
yeah.
factories was Savage, correct?
Yes.
One of the manufacturers. I mean, when I was a kid on the farm, we had an old Savage 22 that I used to love firing. That was a great little rifle.
Mm.
So what was the bottom line of this American chapter then, William?
Savage Stevens made a whole lot of rifles, like the Enfield number four and Mark Ones for the British. Um, I think like I said, I think 1.2 million. Um, there's a very distinctive symbol on them. It's like the flaming grenade. I think that the
Oh,
U.S. whatever
Stamp.
ordnance department or something would stamp on them to
Oh,
mark
interesting.
because they were lend lease, right? They weren't necessarily giving them to them or selling them to them.
Right.
They were lending them or leasing them. But yeah, I think a big takeaway is that the number 4 is a very North American sort of industrial achievement. While the British made more than either of the two North American countries, it was standardized. It was sort of, I'd say, perfected in North America, if I may be so bold.
Okay. All right. Well, we like the boldness here.
We do.
And let's get into the part that you're really the expert on, the wood part. So
Sure.
the factory now exists in Long Branch. The steel's coming in, all the different parts that you're talking about before. Springs have to be sourced here and there, and everyone's adapting and scrambling. But let's talk about the furniture, which is a fancy way of saying all the wooden parts of the rifle. Make sure you don't burn yourself and you can hold it properly. Historically, the Lee-Enfield the wood furniture was made of walnut, correct?
Yeah, that was the sort of ideal lumber they used. It's very dimensionally stable, so it doesn't warp too poorly. They tried to dry it before, but that wasn't always possible. It's a very tough wood. It's got a very tight grain pattern. And so when you're machining it, especially with an inexperienced machinist, if you make a mistake, the chips that come out kind of follow the grain pattern. So it does less damage.
Okay.
When you goof up, basically. And also, to be perfectly honest, it's one of those legacies from maybe the 19th century or whatever. Walnut's a really beautiful wood.
It is a beautiful wood.
The militaries wanted really nice rifles to give their troops,
A
so
burled
they could
finished.
suffer.
You know, your red coat, your walnut rifle.
Exactly.
Heaven
You know?
forbid you fire it though and wear out the glue.
Right, so then you have to clean it, and it's a whole thing.
Yes, well.
Yeah, but it became very quickly apparent that there wasn't enough walnut. So in Canada, realistically, walnut only grows kind of like south of Toronto, maybe a bit north, like Aurora. There was a big plantation in Aurora, but it's a very hard wood to come across. The British and I think the Americans used a lot of French walnut, which was sort of not an option anymore.
I wonder why.
Yeah, exactly.
Couldn't get
And,
Vichy's fresh spring water either for some reason.
What? No Perrier for the mess dinner?
And yeah, and even for the Americans, remember, because it's they're trying to make everything all at once.
Right.
So walnut's important for all kinds of things. It's a hardwood. They use it
Yeah.
from, it even gets used in truck bodies. Think of all the furniture and buildings you have to make to house these new armies.
True.
So walnut runs out very quickly, and then the sort of 3 woods that get used by these 3 countries to replace walnut are good enough, I suppose. So beech, yellow beech, or sorry, American beech, yellow birch, and the hard maples, they call them.
Right.
Beech and birch were mostly British and American. I think very early on they swapped almost entirely with beech and birch. Maple was the sort of Canadian one, which is sort of fun because it was sort of everywhere, and a lot of it came from Quebec, I think. So they still got their finger in that pie too.
Naturally.
But
So at this point, this is really where the Lee-Enfield becomes, dare I say it, a beach of a rifle. But, I have to ask, I mean, there's so many maple trees, and the maple being a symbol of our country. Why not just make them all out of maple?
I think there was a pretty solid problem with manpower. It always comes down to manpower in military industry. It's very easy to find people who are willing to work in sawmills. It's surprisingly difficult to find people who want to live in the woods over the winter and cut down the trees. And typically, when a world war breaks out, the people who are willing to do that join the infantry, and then they're ready to go. So it's I think it's they have a hard time actually acquiring it. So what they end up doing is they buy a lot of sort of intermediary companies will buy a lot of all of these trees off of farmers in southern Ontario who usually have woodlots. In before the war, they sort of cut down all the trees, and then it wreaked havoc on the environment in southern Ontario. There are photos of, like around Aurora, there are like sandbanks the size of barns. It's crazy.
Really?
Wow.
So everyone started planting woodlots, and then the government said, okay, well, that's nice, but we have a war to fight, so we're going to cut them all down again. And then, yeah. So yeah, a lot of it comes probably from woodlots, but there's not a lot of, the records about that aren't there, so it's kind of hard to be definitive.
So really, it's just like trying to get your hands on whatever wood is available.
Exactly.
Essentially.
I
Kiln
like your
drying
point
the
about the
wood.
lumberjacks, because you're absolutely right. You think of all the different famous Canadian war stories about individual heroics, and it's always like, Corporal so-and-so who'd been a lumberjack up in North.
Yes.
Exactly.
Oh, war? That sounds better than being a lumberjack.
Yeah. More of those stories of lumberjacks than the bank clerk who went
Exactly.
won the Victoria Cross. But although there were those too, but
There
still.
were indeed,
Yeah.
yeah. So you've got the steel components being worked out. You've got, now we're settling on the wood supply, cutting down every tree within a couple hundred miles of Toronto, and then importing maple from Quebec. So you've got Long Branch is starting to get cooking here, getting the production going. You get the shortages, you get the learning curve. What was it like at the peak of production for Long Branch?
Yeah, so the peak of production kind of came around in 1943, I think. That year they made, I think, a bit over like 300,000 rifles.
Wow.
Yeah, it's huge numbers. I think hectic is a good way of describing it.
Right.
So Colonel Jolley, I don't really know how to pronounce it. I've only ever read the word, but he was
Jolley?
Jolley.
No, it's
Yeah,
a
Jolly.
Jolly. Yeah.
He was sort of an ordnance officer from the Canadian Army who was put in charge of this factory, and he and his staff sort of took a lot of pride in figuring out how to rearrange all the machine tools to make these super efficient production lines. I read a news article, sort of like an investigative, if you will, news article written in, I think, 1941, where the journalist was talking about one machine operator managing 6 machines at a time.
Oh.
So it's very fast, very busy. I think it was in 1943 that they started. They originally did 2 shifts with a few hours at night to sort of clean everything, and then they just decided we need more, so they made it a constant operation, basically 3 shifts.
Do you think they referred to it as a jolly good production run?
I'm sure someone made that point.
So it's a bit of a beehive, isn't it? They're learning on the fly. They're problem solving as issues come up because they don't know, right? All this is very new for them, isn't it? Scaling output hard. It's not just rifles. It's a society that's being reorganized to manufacture them at scale.
Exactly. Manufacturing of lumber items used to be a fairly specialized trade. I mean, there are a lot of last names in the English language, if you think about it, that relate to cutting things
for sure
and making things out of wood.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This was a very, hey, we have like an 18-year-old who doesn't have a job. Let's send them to the factory.
Yeah.
I think it was 60% of the factories worked, or the staff was female. So this was sort of that second wave of women getting into the workforce.
And we're recording this on International Women's Day, so I mean, hey, shout out.
There you go. Exactly.
Yeah.
I think for International Women's Day, I'll also mention that 25%, I think, of the Canada's entire 1 million person workforce was female during the war.
Yeah. That's quite something.
Yeah.
And to get back to the number 4.
Yeah.
Now, William, the number 4 was actually easier for recruits to shoot well, wasn't it? Why is that?
It's probably a number of things. I think they had it was a very simplified weapon. I think it was quite intuitive.
Yeah.
The aperture sight.
It's a nice weapon.
Yeah. Like we mentioned earlier, the aperture sight was a lot easier to sort of pull up a quick sight picture on, as opposed to the sort of earlier V from the SMLE.
So that's when that came in, the change in the aperture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
The heavier barrel made it more accurate. They also made a bunch of training rifles they made 22 caliber number 4s for
The
training.
Cooey.
Yeah, Cooey was involved in that.
Yeah,
But
I used to
it
carry
was
those in
just like,
cadets.
yeah, but they also just had like number 4s chambered in 22.
Yeah. We actually had them at the RMR, Rejoy, in the vault. We used to fire those as part of the Christmas. Remember the turkey shoot we used to do?
Yes. So those are those rifles.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Well.
Yeah.
You know, that would have been helpful for me at Gagetown, because it's I believe there's some people who still remember where on the range I got a perfect score, but it was not my target.
That's
Sadly.
correct. That's correct.
But
You were helpful.
less
You know,
said the
you
better.
took the teamwork and that whole team spirit to
I did
right,
higher
right to the end.
levels.
Right to the end.
Yes.
So, speaking of people who understand wartime realities and the challenges of soldiering, it's time for our second fantasy sponsor.
Yes, indeed. And William, you will enjoy this one. Tonight
or not.
or not. That's right. Depends on how you look at it. Tonight is unofficially brought to you by Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa's Smooth Blend, the Scotch that's been helping make legends for generations.
Distilled in Ottawa with notes of kiwi polish, wet wool, and the quiet certainty that someone, somewhere, is checking your drill.
Oh, yes. Best enjoyed after a long day of infantry reality, or after explaining to your friends for the third time that your side hustle is being in the primary reserve, not playing with guns.
That's right. Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa's Smooth Blend, for when your weeks are filled with working and studying, and your weekends have kit inspections, lectures, and shivering in Petawawa.
Beautiful, scenic Petawawa.
Any of that resonate with you there, William?
Yeah, I wish that was a real thing.
Okay, so let's wrap up with the so what part of it. By 1944, Canada's well in it. We've got Normandy, Italy, the Scheldt. How does the number 4 perform, and what's the legacy of making it?
Yeah, so I think it's has a reputation for being a very good bolt action rifle during the war. I think one of the things we overlook is that this is sort of what isn't said about it. So it is said that, it's reliable, it's accurate, the bolt works very smoothly. But I think after our discussion about the lumber and how much of a rush job it was, and they didn't have time to dry it all the time, and the machining was, you don't really hear complaints about the furniture cracking and breaking all the time.
Right.
So just the ability of, I'd say, the Western Allied military industry to adapt to these kind of changes, I think is a good. It speaks well to the number 4.
And it transformed the way we produce weapons. Right. That was the big jump.
Yeah. Yep. And they sort of proliferated. They made it everywhere. The Canadian War Museum actually has a long branch Lee-Enfield that was captured by Canadian soldiers in Somalia in the 90s.
Really?
Oh, wow.
It had gone to a Somali somehow. I don't know how that happened. And then it was recaptured by Canadians.
That's
so,
awesome.
If you ever get the chance to go there, check that out.
I'll check that out.
Oh, I want to take a look at that. That's amazing.
Yeah. And there was such a surplus of them afterwards, because I think, Long Branch was, as you said, I think in 43 or 44, they're pumping out 300,000 a year. And so when 45 came, they were still pumping out that capacity, but they weren't being absorbed into the military system. So they had this surplus, and they cut the stock at the end in the 50s and 60s. They would cut the stock into called a sport stock and make it look like a hunting rifle. And the government sold those off as surplus. I know that because we had one on the farm when I was a kid growing up. And that's why I know the Enfield inside and out. And so when I first joined cadets and they're teaching us how to use these things, I could strip and assemble it faster than my instructors. And it's a beautiful weapon. Like all the parts just pop, boom, boom, bam. It's just so well made. Yeah.
And
William, I just want to say thank you very much for bringing this to life. It's easy to talk about the men behind the wire, but it's just as important to remember the people in the sawmills, the men, and as you said, the women, and on the assembly lines who put the tools in their hands.
Yeah, without those people, I mean, we wouldn't be able to function. The war would not have been won. So, yeah, big shout out to them. Well, that's it for this week's Rum Ration podcast. Please like, subscribe, share with your friends, and the next time you see a number 4 in your museum, take a close look at the wood. There's a whole lot of Canadian history in that birch. Because you know what? Yeah, or that maple, because it's still a birch of a rifle.
You're not going to let that one go, eh?
Had to do that. I have to do it.
William, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Cheers to history.
Cheers to history.
Thanks.